loved it. I loved everything. It was the best week I've maybe ever had.
But you know, paradise often looks very different from within than it does from without.
These people have a very different experience of the Dominican Republic than tourists do. The people of Maquiteria don't spend much time on the tourist beaches of Puerto Plata.
The Dominican Republic is a developing country, what we used to call a third world country. The United States and her allies, which would have included Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, they were the first world. The Soviet Union and her allies were the second world. Third world, then, was everybody else. Well, it turned out that everybody else was most of the people on the planet.
It included all of the countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, except for Israel, the Indian subcontinent, most of Asia, and the Pacific Rim, except for Australia and New Zealand. In all, those nations now account for some 80% of the world's population. At least from the point of view of people living in the first and second worlds, the 20% of us fortunate enough to live in countries like the United States, Canada, France, or even Russia, that from our perspective, these third world countries are somehow different. They're not like us. The vast majority of Haitians live in absolute poverty, with an estimated income of only $250 a year. If you include my watch, my glasses, my shoes, what I'm wearing now costs more than $250. Why is there this great discrepancy in opportunities between developed and developing countries? The material we'll be looking at won't always be easy to deal with. The issues are often complex and the effects we discuss are often pretty bleak. Lesser developed countries now make up about 80% of the world's population. People who live in more developed nations like Canada or the United States are only 20% of the global population. And yet we own, control, or consume approximately 80% of the world's annual wealth, which leaves the majority population with access to only about 20% of the world's wealth.
So the next issue we need to look at is why we should care at all. What difference does it make to us, to the 20%? What conditions in the third world are like? Just about the only Canadian ingredient in this Canadian breakfast would be the milk from our cereal. Everything else comes from someplace else, and most of that someplace else is in the third world. Cocoa from Africa, bananas and coffee from Latin America, tea from Asia, sugar and citrus fruits from the Caribbean. As far as we can tell, the first outbreak of SARS occurred in the Guangdong province of China in November of 2002. Local officials simply didn't have the financial resources to respond appropriately or even to adequately monitor the outbreak of the new disease. And as the disease began to spread, the Chinese government made the unfortunate decision of trying to conceal the extent of the problem. The first Toronto case showed up only 5 months later. A 78-year-old woman who had recently returned from a visit to Hong Kong was admitted to hospital on March 7, 2003. Virtually all the other cases of SARS that occurred in Canada that year could be traced back to that single individual.
By March 25th, there were 27 suspected cases in the city. And 4 weeks later, the World Health Organization was so concerned that they issued a travel advisory on Toronto. That advisory had an immediate impact on tourism. Conventions and conferences were canceled. Hotel occupancy rates were cut in half. Investment and security firms estimated that the disease cost Canada $30 million a day.
Before we can even begin to consider how to address the poverty which is so common throughout the developing world, we need to understand the structures responsible for creating that poverty.
Essentially, what it amounted to was European nations rushing around the globe, laying claim to the territories they came upon, even though virtually all of those territories were already occupied and had viable social structures in place. Then early in the 17th century, the Dutch began planting sugar on the islands. Sugar was a luxury item in the 1600s. European pharmacies sold it by the gram. Following the Dutch example, the British established sugar plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, St. Kitts, and the other small islands. These plantations required large amounts of labor, and because the native populations had been eliminated, Europe had to seek that labor elsewhere. They found it in Africa. Slaves from the west coast of Africa were transported to the sugar islands. The slave plantations of what were now called the West Indies soon became the most valuable possessions of the British Empire. Before the end of the 17th century, tiny St. Kitts, which only had an area of slightly more than 100 square kilometers, was valued more than all of British North America because it produced sugar. Historians of the era have suggested that the profit from these sugar islands financed the British Industrial Revolution. They talk about the triangle trade. Ships carrying sugar or cotton or other raw materials from the New World brought them back to England, where they were sold at a profit, processed by manufacturers, and sold again at a greater profit. Manufactured goods were then loaded on these same ships and traded along the African coast for slaves. The slaves were then transported to the Caribbean, sold, realizing another profit. The ships were loaded up with sugar and agricultural products, went back to England, and so on. The resources of these nations had been developed not to meet the needs of the local population, but to service the desires of the occupying power. Colonies were developed to supply the commodities needed by countries whose economies were based on manufacturing. And even after gaining independence, the economies of most developing countries remained based in commodity production. Nations like the Dominican Republic, which made a commitment to modernization in the 1970s, had to find ways of raising money to continue the process of industrialization. And they could only do this by purchasing goods and services from richer countries. Until they were able to meet all their needs internally, they would have to continue purchasing machinery, industrial equipment, expertise, medicine, petroleum, and so on from more developed nations. And in order to do that, they required what was called foreign exchange. You had to grow 6 times as much sugar to buy one tractor in 1983 than you had to in 1979.
Now, if you can't afford to purchase foreign exchange and you don't have the ability to earn it, there's a third way to acquire it. You can borrow it. And in the 1970s, that's what countries like the Dominican Republic did. And it was a big mistake. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea. Countries borrow money all the time. That's what bonds are, a way of borrowing money from your own citizens in order to pay for government operations. And most countries probably had their borrowing under control until about 1973. That was the year the price of oil went up.
The way banks make a profit is by loaning out the money they have on deposit and charging their borrowers a higher rate of interest than they pay their depositors. In 1984, the year of the protests in Santo Domingo, the collective debt of developing countries was so large that the total amount of foreign aid these nations received that year was $31 billion less than the amount that they paid in interest on their debt.
And by 1992, that amount had grown to $100 billion. Poor countries were paying out $100 billion a year more than they received in all forms of aid from richer countries.
But when interest rates started to go up, Brazil's economy went into a dive. During 1987 and 1988, inflation was running at 20% a month. Consumer prices between 1985 and 1990 rose 22,000%.
I think that the debt remains the single greatest factor hindering development in the South today. A debt so large that many countries can't even make their interest payments, let alone have any real hope of ever being able to pay it off. Some of the biggest problems that the people in the South had to deal with over the past few decades turned out to be issues which small, locally based cooperatives and non-governmental organizations like the Y were quite capable of dealing with. Improvements in sanitation, improvements in nutrition, providing basic health care and primary education, ensuring that people had adequate housing and access to safe drinking water.
So, yes, there have been overall improvements in the quality of life for people living in most developing countries. The major exceptions, however, have been the nations of sub-Saharan Africa. And they're an important and significant exception because they demonstrate just how fragile those improvements can be. Africans face many difficulties. Parts of the continent are vulnerable to periodic drought, which compromises its capacity for food self-sufficiency. Intertribal violence still rages in many regions. But the most overwhelming problem Africans face at the moment is the uncontrolled spread of AIDS.
It is impossible to convey adequately that this is the most nightmarish plague the world has ever. The grandmothers, they bury their own children, and then they look after their orphan grandchildren. In the country of Zambia, your life expectancy is 30 years.
So, one of the most important steps that individual Canadians can take to help improve the quality of life of people in developing countries is simply to be informed about the issues and to make their opinions known to policymakers. There are other steps we can take as well, of course. As we become better informed about the issues, we'll discover that there are certain lifestyle choices that we can make that have a direct impact on people in other countries. Have conditions improved in the developing world over the past decade? It will depend upon lesser developed and more developed nations working together to ensure that all the people of the world have reasonable access to a decent standard of living and the satisfaction of basic human needs. There's no guarantee that any of these things will happen, but they could and they should.